Hi, you're listening to Sgt Dosey Speaks podcast, produced by the Get Global Network.
This is America. Don't catch you slipping now. Don't catch you slipping now.
Let's get to it. Last week, I think I mentioned this in a prior podcast, but I'll revisit it because last week I had an opportunity to travel to state capital, Sacramento, California, to speak on behalf of victims of deadly police force and their families regarding the California Act to Save Lives, AB 392. I spoke to a panel of legislators along with the co-author of AB 392, Assemblywoman Shirley Weber, as well as did a couple of family members of victims who have been killed by police officers who use deadly force as a first resort rather than a last resort. And if any of you had an opportunity to listen to my podcast from the prior week, you will have heard an interview that I did with a police chief in Citrus Heights, California, by the name of Ronald A. Lawrence. Now, Chief Lawrence is also the president of the California Association of Police Chiefs. So having had a debate discussion, if you will, some days preceding my testimony before the legislators in Sacramento, I already had an idea about the kinds of opposition that they would put forth in their presentation, and so I was well prepared. And so what I'm going to do this week in my podcast is play for you portions of the hearing in front of the Public Safety Committee in Sacramento, California. The first voice that you will hear is one of the co-authors, Assemblywoman Shirley Weber, who is explaining exactly what the intent behind Assembly Bill 392, the California Act to Save Lives, is. And then you will hear my presentation, which was, I only had like about 2.5 minutes to speak on it. And so I tried to cover as much as I thought was important for them to know in that very short period of time. And then it followed up with a couple of questions from some of the committee members. And you will then hear my responses to the questions that they posed. So here we're going to begin with co-author of the California Act to Save Lives, Assembly Bill 392, Assemblywoman Shirley Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Public Safety Committee. I want to begin by first thanking the Chair for his support and ongoing help in fashioning this bill and organizing today's meeting. I want to thank all of the members because I think I've met with each one of you individually on both sides of the aisle to make sure that you understand what our goals are, what we want to accomplish with AB 392. I'm here to present to you AB 392, the California Act to Save Lives. This bill seeks to change California's legal standard for when police can use deadly force to match best practices already in place at some departments, and that we know work to keep both officers and the public safe. In 2017, officers killed 172 people in California. Most of those were unarmed. Of the 15 police departments with the highest per capita rates of police killings in the nation, 5 of them are in California: Bakersfield, Stockton, Long Beach, Santa Ana, and San Bernardino. In 2015, police in Kern County killed more people per capita than any other U.S. county. Current law results in officers killing civilians far more often than is necessary, leaving many families and communities devastated and the general public less safe. These tragedies disproportionately impact communities of color. Studies show police killed unarmed young black men at more than 20 times the rate they kill young white men. This has understandably created a rift between police and community members to the detriment of public safety. The power of police officers to use deadly force is perhaps the most significant responsibility we confer on any public official, and it must be guided by the goal of safeguarding human life. Police officers should never take a human life when there are alternatives. However, current law sanctions police use of deadly force even when officers do not face an imminent threat to their life or bodily security, and even when officers have reasonable alternatives at their disposal to safely address a situation without taking anyone's life. California's existing law governing when a homicide by an officer is justified was written in 1872. This code, being the single oldest unamended use of force statute in the country, not only fails to include best practices, but authorizes deadly force that violates the U.S. Constitution. Penal Code 835A, which regulates police use of force, was enacted in 1957 and is the second oldest unamended use of force statute in the country. AB 392 is about preventing unnecessary deaths by clarifying law enforcement's obligations when making the decision to use deadly force. This bill limits the use of deadly force by a police officer to those situations where it is necessary to prevent imminent and serious bodily injury or death to the officer or another person. The bill will also require that officers use de-escalation tactics whenever possible. The bill is squarely in line with best practice and standards recognized by academics and experts in the field, including the California Department of Justice, and is modeled after policies that are currently in place at several law enforcement agencies around the country. These standards are known to reduce serious use of force without having any negative impact on officer safety or public safety. As a result of this bill, all agencies will be required to update their policies to understand these best practices and to ensure that officers are trained to these standards. Some police departments in California have recognized they need to hold themselves to a higher standard, updating their use of force policies to adopt best practices like requiring de-escalation when feasible, using force that is proportional to law enforcement objectives, and grounding their policies in the sanctity of human life. A 3-year study of Seattle's use of force policy, which includes key elements of AB 392, showed that it resulted in officers using less force with no negative impact on officers' safety or public safety. Since San Francisco implemented a similar policy in 2016, their uses of force has also gone down dramatically. Both of these policies, like the other policies adopted across the country that contain the key elements of this bill, were developed under the guidance of the Obama-era Department of Justice. In addition, the California Attorney General's recommended changes to Sacramento Police Department's use of force tracks closely with AB 392. For example, the AG recommended that Sacramento Police Department, quote, require that officers exhaust all reasonably available alternatives before using deadly force, much like what is required under AB 392. It is obvious to so many people that our current standard for using force, and specifically deadly force, does not recognize the sanctity of human life or protect people's fundamental human rights. AB 392 is a necessary step to affirming the sanctity of human life and protecting human life. For nearly a century and a half, Californians have witnessed the justification of police homicides due to a standard that allows the use of deadly force, even if there are other alternatives. Far too many days have gone by with far too many deaths because of the inaction of those who have the power to enact change. The need for reform is clear and long overdue, and it's time to make clear that the sanctity of human life is policing's highest priority. It is time for us to enact a state policy that will save lives.
My name is Cheryl Dorsey. I'm a retired Los Angeles Police Department sergeant. As a retired veteran sergeant of the Los Angeles Police Department, having spent 20 years in patrol, my lived experiences form the basis of supporting legislation that could potentially save lives. Evidence of unnecessary use of deadly force and the reluctance by some officers to de-escalate contentious encounters exist. Just because an alleged suspect attempts to evade arrest by jumping fences and hiding in a backyard, he should not be executed when cornered. Stephon Clark was chased into a contained area. Officers were aided by the illumination of an air unit. Rather than seek cover and concealment and establish a perimeter, the officer fired 20 rounds at Stephon. They were consumed by contagious gunfire, their own. The officers claimed they thought Stephon had shot them. He hadn't. The officers claimed they thought Stephon had a gun. He didn't. Because great deference is given to an officer's version of events, the prosecutor sided with the officers, even though neither paused in the midst of those 20 rounds to reassess whether or not a threat existed. While officers are called to make split-second life or death decisions, officers are also expected to rely on their training and common sense. Poor tactics lead to unnecessary shootings. Officers are trained in target identification and have practiced don't shoot scenarios and should know what they are shooting and why. Absent immediate defense of life or some other exigent circumstance, de-escalation should always be a consideration. For those who say that having officers go through a mental checklist prior to firing their weapon would endanger their lives, I say they are being intellectually dishonest. For those who say that AB 392 will negatively influence potential recruits, I say that not everyone who wants to be the police should be the police. Being a police officer requires good judgment, mental readiness, and the ability to act in concert with one's training, much like a surgeon, a pilot, or a chef. Psychological reevaluations will help in this regard. If a police officer lacks the the skill set or temperament to respond appropriately to stressful, high-risk activities, which is inherent to police work, this is not the job for you. Police chiefs and unions who minimize and mitigate bad behavior do a disservice to the community. AB 392 will not prevent a police officer from shooting someone without just cause, but it may give an officer pause, and for that reason, I support this bill.
Dr. Weber.
No, I was just wondering, I don't know if the other officer, she asked him the questions. I don't know if she had anything to add to it, but we can.
That would be helpful.
Thank you. So what I know is that making split-second decisions are inherent to police work. If sense were common, everyone would have it. And I said in my statement that not everyone who wants to be the police should be. And so certainly we want to hire officers, people from the community who can make those split-second decisions. And it doesn't require anything extra for an officer in a life or death situation, much like what it would require me to do if I commit a traffic stop. I've got to decide really quick where I want to stop you, when I'm going to activate my lights, when I'm going to contact my RTO communications and let them know where we are, how I'm going to position my vehicle so that I'm safe as I approach you and you if I have you get out. All of these things I have to do fairly quickly, much like the use of deadly force. What we're seeing is that officers are using deadly force as a first resort when they can't catch someone, when someone is failing to comply, as opposed to a last resort, which is what officers are taught to do after you've done everything that you have available to you, and none of that has worked. And you can get to that in a matter of seconds, but you're only to use deadly force after you've done everything else that you've been trained, taught, and know to do. And then there needs to be some reasonableness with regards to the number of rounds that are fired, because on the Los Angeles Police Department, we are taught, fire 2 rounds in rapid succession, reassess the threat before you fire, in the case of Stephon Clark, 18 more. This next response that you're going to hear again is from the AB 392 hearing that was held in Sacramento, California on last week. And this is in response to a question that was posed by one of the Public Safety Committee members with regards to when an officer should use deadly force and, what makes it reasonable versus necessary. I'm responding also to a statement that had been previously made by the president of the Fraternal Order of Police Officers and their representative, a female attorney whose name escapes me, but their position was pretty much this in line with Police Chief from Citrus Heights, Ronald Lawrence, who stated that, you're asking officers to do something that is unreasonable, and it was described as superhuman if an officer has to go through a mental checklist prior to using deadly force. They also, during their opposition to AB 392, put forth a female deputy sheriff, I believe, from Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, who was involved in a encounter with a robbery suspect, and in that encounter her partner had been shot and killed. She survived. Not really sure whether or not she was struck by a bullet, but she did survive the encounter. And so while it was emotional and of course any loss of life is tragic, I think that it was somewhat contrived and that they would use this female officer who had a partner shot in the line of duty and have her say that going forward, if she were to find herself in a similar situation, it would be very difficult for her to figure out what to do because she would want to be second guessed. And so to that young lady, I say, ma'am, maybe this is not the job for you, because if I were supervising her and I knew that to be her mindset, and to be quite honest with you, now that she's put it out there for public consumption, and her statement is available on the internet if you were to want to hear the entire hearing regarding AB 392. You can listen to it in its entirety. It exists. And for her to say that she would hesitate to use her duty weapon if when faced with danger makes me then, as a police supervisor, think that this lady is now a liability, because I would hate to put any one of my officers in a patrol car with her knowing that she has now made it known she's afraid to use a gun if faced with a deadly situation. No one, certainly AB 392 is not saying, and I don't support that any police officer, if faced with a life or death situation, we have an acronym that we use, IDLE, Immediate Defense of Life. If you are in an idle situation, you absolutely have the right and would be expected to use deadly force. And so that's not what I'm arguing against. And for this young officer, this young deputy to say that now if she found herself in a similar situation, AB 392's existence would cause her to second guess whether or not she could fire her weapon means she don't need to be the police. She's going to get somebody hurt. And if Sacramento Sheriff's Department out there, Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, if you're listening, Sacramento Sheriff deputies, you need to know you got a coward in your ranks. And you need to know that every time she puts on that uniform and gets out in patrol, if that's where she works, she's liable to get somebody hurt. So what you will hear next is my response to officers need to be superhuman in order to figure out when it's appropriate versus when it's not appropriate to use deadly force.
I'd like to respond as having been someone who's been in patrol for 20 years, both as an officer and a supervisor. And what I can tell you is that I felt no restraint about my safety in terms of how I respond to suspects who often ran from me as a female officer who weren't happy about the service that I was providing at that time. And during my 20 years, I worked South Bureau Crash, Community Resources Against Gangs. I was involved in dealing with violent criminals on a daily basis. I shot no one. I had suspects run from me, fight me, curse me. I shot no one. And so as a police officer, you're required to be able to rely on your training. And sometimes your training means being able to communicate with someone in such a way that you're able to gain compliance. Sometimes that training means I've got to chase you and wrestle with you to get you into control. But what I'm not allowed to do is, if you are profane, if you are not complying, is punish you because you are not. I'm not allowed to shoot you because I can't catch you. I'm not allowed to choke you to death because you won't turn around. And so as a police officer, I can tell you for 20 years, I did that job, and I did it facing all of the things that we've talked about here, and I felt no constraint in terms of how I comported myself day to day. I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to ask anybody. I didn't call the landline and ask my watch commander. I relied on my training, and I did what I was supposed to do, expected to do, required to do. And I'm not superhuman. You see me, I'm just a girl.
And now it's time for Did You Know? Did you know that there was a police shooting trial going on right now in Minneapolis, Minnesota? It's the police shooting of a lady by the name of Justine Damon. I think she's from Australia, and she was shot and killed by a Somalian police officer on the Minneapolis Police Department about a year or two ago, and his name is Mohammed Noor. And in that fatal shooting of Justine Damon, Officer Noor is asserting the defense that, you know what police officers do when they get in a shooting, he was in fear for his safety, right? Now listen, any loss of life is tragic. I've said that before, and I don't justify deadly use of police force when it's unnecessary, but let's be honest, there are two justice systems for civilians, and there's two justice systems for police officers. And so right now, we're going to see what happens when when you look like me, when your skin color is like mine. He's of Somalia descent, but he's a black man. And he's a black police officer who was on trial for shooting a white woman who he said scared him. And he thought he was in the midst of an ambush situation, is what his defense is starting to turn out to be. And that was why he fired his weapon, because Justine called the police. She thought there was some kind of an assault occurring behind her residence, and she decided to come outside to, alert police to the area where she thought something was going on. And she approached the police car, startled former officer, because he's been fired, startled former officer Noor, who then shot her and killed her. And so he's saying that she startled him, she scared him, he thought they were in an ambush situation, and that's his defense. And listen, don't you know that police department, the police chief is testifying, according to articles that I read in preparation for this story. The police chief testified that his partner and him, they never had a discussion about an ambush situation. The police union has all kinds of theories and ideas that they're putting forth with regards to whether Officer Noor was substandard, whether or not Officer Noor used good judgment. And it's almost like they actually are. They are going against their officer the first time in the history of ever that I can recall, at least recently, when you've had a police union, a police chief, a FOP, not liking a police shooting that they saw, wasn't excited about it, couldn't get their head around a police officer shooting a civilian. Well, when the civilian is black, then they're all over it, right? It all makes sense. But when you got a black police officer shooting a white woman, and I'm not saying that this lady deserved to be killed, be clear. So let me be absolutely, positively clear. This lady did not deserve to die. But the extent to which this police department, this police association, union, the officers, the chief are going to nail Mohammed Noor to the cross, if you will, is something that I've never seen before. And so listen, I just want to prepare you guys who are listening, who think that this black police officer is going to be found not guilty in the shooting death of this white woman. You need to know that they are poised and ready to find him guilty, I believe, in Minnesota. I will keep you posted. The trial is ongoing. Maybe by the end of this week and in time for next week's podcast, they will have come back with a jury decision. But be prepared for Officer Noor, a black man from Somalia, former Minnesota police officer, on trial in the shooting death of a white woman, Justine Damon. Till next time, you guys, be good and be safe.
This is America. Don't catch you slipping now. Don't catch you slipping now. Look what I'm whipping now. This is America. Don't catch you slipping now.
You have been listening to the Sgt Dosey Speaks podcast, produced by the Get Global Network. Sgt Cheryl Dorsey is a television commentator, social justice advocate, and is also well known for her book, Black and Blue, Creation of a Social Advocate, an autobiography of her 20-year career as a black woman on the Los Angeles Police Department. The book details what she learned as an LAPD insider. Sgt Dorsey can be contacted through her website, sgtdosseyspeaks.com, or via any of her social media sites like YouTube and Facebook. Take the time to subscribe to her YouTube channel and also subscribe to this podcast via major podcast networks like iHeartRadio, iTunes, Spotify, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, Google Podcast, and many others. The podcast is also available on wireless speaker systems like Alexa and Sonos.